Hurricanes, hailstorms, tornadoes, and wildfires. These are just some of the weather hazards that displace families and disrupt lives. Many of us are familiar with the scenes of devastation these hazards cause, and the recovery process for affected communities can take months, even years. In the most extreme circumstances, some may never be whole again. This may prompt many of you to ask, what's being done to reduce the risks associated with these hazards? To answer this question, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety presents the Disaster Discussions Podcast. Join me, your host, Armand Brody, as I sit down with professionals in the insurance, science, construction, and resiliency industries who will help us explore the intersection of these hazards with the built environment. We'll bring you in-depth conversations with experts from across the country and highlight how science is engineering real-world solutions for home and business owners to create safer, more resilient communities. Join us for these discussions every month. And to make sure you don't miss an episode, go subscribe to the Disaster Discussions Podcast on your favorite podcast app. We also invite you to engage with us on social media, to ask your questions, share your thoughts, and to learn more about the IBHS mission.
Hey, welcome to the Disaster Discussions Podcast, a production of IBHS, where we explore the intersection of severe weather and the built environment. So first of all, thanks to all of our subscribers. We've just completed our first year of the Disaster Discussions Podcast. We hope you had a chance to check out some of our greatest hits from last year in 2023. As we moved on into 2024, we've actually started focusing a little bit more on tornadoes and tornado damage. We had the chance to sit down and talk with some of our researchers at IBHS who had the opportunity to participate in a damage survey with the National Weather Service in Columbia. We had a few of the forecasters who talked about how they assess tornado damage following a tornado from the Weather Service perspective, and then how wind engineers can help them understand the modes of damage that occur from these storms every single year. So we're going to continue along that thread today with a special guest, a wonderful researcher and a personal friend of mine. I should introduce myself. This is Giammanco coming to you live today. I'm the Managing Director of Standards and Data Analytics. Sorry about that. Got to remember my own title. As our special guest host today for Disaster Discussions. But on to our special guest is Dr. David Roueche. David is an associate professor of structural engineering at Auburn. He has a PhD in structural engineering from the University of Florida, and he focuses his work on understanding and reducing the impacts of extreme windstorms on the built environment. David has been published in numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, and also a big feat, and I want to mention this, has secured over $6 million in research funding, which is pretty impressive. So David serves as the associate director of the STEER Reconnaissance Network that's funded by the National Science Foundation. STEER stands for Structural Extreme Events Reconnaissance. The data collected by the STEER teams have been invaluable, one, to the work we've done at IBHS, but across the wind engineering community. But David is an expert in wind damage, especially from hurricanes and tornadoes. So David, welcome to the Disaster Discussions Podcast. It's great to have you on, and it's great to hear you and see you today.
Thanks, Ian. Good to be here, and enjoy the opportunity to be able to talk with you about this. I feel like we've had a number of informal past meetings, and we'll just go off talking. So it's nice to actually have a block of time to talk about.
Absolutely, that's kind of what we do. We definitely can sit here and talk forever on really windstorms and windstorm damage. But we're going to start off a little bit about how you got into wind engineering. What was sort of the impetus for you to head down this multidisciplinary career route that is a blend of the weather world and the engineering communities?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey, and I think it goes all the way back to really childhood, growing up in Jacksonville, Florida, which of course exposed to a number of hurricanes. Although it was always funny to us growing up how that we got used to tracking hurricanes, and we grew up in a mobile home, manufactured home. I was one of 10 kids, and so we had a big family and had a mobile home with an addition on the back. So because of that, we were aware of our vulnerability. We knew that we did not have a very strong structure, and so if there was a hurricane coming, we were thinking about, okay, where are we going to go? Are we going to go to grandparents' house? Are we going to go up to a church or some other permanent building? And so I think that just increased the awareness, even from a young age, that, we're using the hurricane tracker maps and seeing where things are. And so that at least gave me an awareness of, hey, some structures are more vulnerable than others, what wind damage can do. And thankfully, we didn't have any significant. Jacksonville always seems to skirt, not get as impacted as much as it as you would think. But that mindset then kind of followed. I also worked construction and did some other things in high school. So then I kind of got the practical side of how buildings are constructed. And then I also enjoyed math and science. And so I sort of took all those together and ultimately ended up at the University of Florida. And still really wasn't, when I first got there, wasn't doing much in the way of wind. I started doing some research on like closed cell spray foams and, there as a water barrier, secondary water barrier, things like that with my advisor at the time, David Pravat. And, but it really kicked off sort of the tornado wind research was in 2011. Just graduated with my undergraduate degree, civil engineering from the University of Florida. And like I said, I've been working as an undergraduate researcher with Dr. Pravat, and then literally the day after my graduation, I think the day before my graduation was when the Tuscaloosa tornado hit, April 27th, 2011. And he had talked with a few of his colleagues and had gotten an NSF rapid, or at least a commitment to an NSF rapid. And so he's like, hey, want to come join me on this tornado deployment? And I'm like, hey, I've got golf plans the day after my graduation, and do I really want to do this? But he was good at talking me into it. It sounded like an interesting opportunity, and so we drove up to Tuscaloosa, 15 hours I think it was, or 10 hours I guess it was, up to Tuscaloosa, and that was just an eye-opening experience, just seeing the devastation. I still vividly remember those first couple of scenes, just standing in the center of the path and it literally looking like a bomb went off. What I envisioned in terms of just trees down, homes leveled, and so on. And I think that's really what kicked it off. And so I know it's kind of a long-winded answer, but that's been the journey to getting to this point, really motivating even what I do today.
Yeah, a lot of us have those personal stories that got us into sort of what we do. So you've now experienced a whole lot of windstorms. You can hear my dogs in the background. They've decided they don't like somebody that's walking past us real quick. So we could bring in the special hound dogs here in a little bit if we so choose. But let's talk a little bit about your assessment. You've seen a lot of damage from hurricanes to tornadoes across your career now. Talk about where you feel our built environment is from a windstorm perspective. Are we making progress? Are we not? Or where are the holes? Where are the things we're doing right? What are the things we're doing wrong? Just give me that general assessment of where you think we are in our resilience against windstorms.
That's a great question, and I think to answer that, we really have to separate, unfortunately, the two storms, and I think it's less about the two storms and it's really more about where the homes are that are being affected by these storms. But when we look at hurricane performance, which is primarily going to affect homes in the coastal regions, within 50 miles or so of the 50 miles, 100 miles of the coast, we're generally seeing a lot of improvement and a lot of better performance now than we were before. As part of my role with STEER and even just the other research that I do, a big part of that is just collecting these standardized data sets across multiple storms. We collect the information in the same way that documents, when the structure was built, where it's located, as much of the load path as we can detail, what wind speeds it was exposed to, terrain, things like that. And what's been interesting is that the structural performance under hurricanes is really excellent right now. In terms of, we just don't see a lot of structural damage during even a design level hurricane event. We've had some with Hurricane Laura, with Hurricane Michael, et cetera, that were close and in some areas exceeded the design wind speeds. And in the modern kind of code compliant homes, it's just rare to see structural damage. And by structural damage, I'm meaning, rafters or trusses have come off, or even roof sheathing has been uplifted, walls collapsed, things like that. We just don't see that type of damage anymore. And so I think that's definite progress. We do still see that damage in the older homes, and we just don't see it in the newer ones. So I think we've definitely made progress there. On the hurricane side, though, and sort of with those, what we do see a lot of problems with, and I know you're very familiar with it, is more on the building envelope. So the windows, the roof covering, the wall cladding, those where you've got lots of different components that are all, you're relying upon contractors to install, hundreds of elements correctly. And it's just, there's lots of opportunities for something to go wrong. Even if it's theoretically a perfect system that should be fine, even just the construction aspect of it can introduce those weaknesses. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. And so I guess to summarize from the hurricane perspective, structurally, yes, we've made a ton of progress and we're doing much better. Building envelope, it's really hard to see a significant trend and improved performance, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a good one to kind of take us into a little bit of the codes discussion as we kind of pivot from hurricanes, and we'll start into severe convective storms here in a minute. But I think folks need to understand that our modern building codes, especially with the design standards that are in the coastal environment, really are an engineering success story. We don't talk about it that much, but David, you're right. Like we looked at Hurricane Ian, and you assessed damage from that storm. We did at IBHS as well, and yeah, structural damage was pretty much non-existent for the modern Florida building code built home. That's a remarkable success story considering where we were 30, 40, 50 years ago from a design perspective. We've done a magical job there. Now, I want you to talk a little bit about how we assess the design level for those coastal environments relative for hurricane, that particular hazard. So how do we get to a good design level for that environment? And then we'll turn our attention to the other side of windstorms in a minute. But go there. How do we do that?
And you're talking more about how do we decide that home X needs to be designed for 140?
Yeah, that's right. How do we get there? How do we get to that number?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and one that I try to address many times when I'm giving talks or anytime discussing with the public, because it's not always clear. So yeah, with hurricanes, it's a little bit more straightforward, or we've been doing it for a while, where we have at least some history of what storms have occurred. So maybe at this point, maybe 75 years of really good records, 50 to 75 years of good records, and you can reconstruct some storms even prior to that, 1800s, 1900s. But essentially what's done now is, we have some historical data to work from, and then different research organizations then create models of hurricanes, and then basically use what they call Monte Carlo simulation to then simulate millions and millions of years of hurricanes impacting the coast of the United States. And they can tweak and modify parameters, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds of it, but using different distributions for how, the radius of maximum winds and the track and the intensity and the pressure drop and so on, and get a whole bucket, if you will, of potential cases, potential landfalling hurricanes. And then from there, we can back out and say, okay, well, the probability of this one location experiencing wind speeds above, 140 miles an hour from a landfalling hurricane is this. And you can work with those things probabilistically, and then ultimately we go back and then try to set some consistent risk levels. And so then we work through it, and if you look at our design wind speed maps, now you see these sort of smooth contours where if you're close to the coast, and if you're, let's say, at the peninsula kind of keys of Florida, maybe 180 miles an hour for a typical structure. You go further inland into, say, Jacksonville, or middle kind of northern portions of Florida, it may be down to 130, because it's just less likely that hurricane's going to impact and stay strong that far inland and so on. So it's intended to be risk consistent. But I think, if I'm not anticipating your next question too much, we're able to do that because we have a reasonably good idea of the wind speed distribution in hurricanes and the physics of it, and how those winds actually translate to the surface on where our built environment is.
Yeah, I think you're kind of reading where I'm heading. So we've done a really great job of setting good design levels along our hurricane-prone coast, and it's really paid off in the reduction of damage in modern code-built homes. We put in our National Wind Mitigation Standard into really what became the ASCE 7 standard back in 1988. Now, let's turn over to the other windstorm, which is going to be severe convective storms. We just came off a year where we had almost, depending on the estimates, you're anywhere between about $55 to $62 billion in severe convective storm loss. Now, a good chunk of that's hail, and I get to mention hail because it's me talking. And for those out there in podcast land who know me, most of my research work at IBHS has been hail related. But the other piece of the severe convective windstorm is the straight line and tornado wind events, whether that's a derecho case, thunderstorm outflow winds, or the violent tornadoes like the 2011 super outbreak, Tuscaloosa, and all the ones in between, the EF0s all the way to the violent ones. So from a code perspective, what do we do in that particular area of the country? How do we assess what is the wind climate there relative to what is a pretty small hazard? The wind footprint from a given severe convective storm is pretty small.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? And I don't know that we have a good answer for that yet, because again, tying it back real quick to hurricanes, a hurricane comes through and we're sampling it with aircraft. We've got surface measurements. And even then, knowing that the hurricane's coming and we can pre-deploy instrumentation and so on, I think you'd agree that we still don't have good enough surface measurements, even for hurricanes. When we know they're coming, they're large, and we can set instrumentation in place of it or in front of it, et cetera. When you come to convective storms, where, yes, we've improved significantly in the ability, so much work has gone into the atmospheric science aspect to be able to predict when storms occur and where they're going to occur within broad regions. But as you mentioned, the footprint is still just so small compared to what we deal with in hurricanes, or just our ability to rapidly deploy and set instrumentation, that we rarely get good data, good surface measurements, talking about wind speeds, pressures, et cetera, from tornadoes. And even when we do, think about just how chaotic the vortex structure of a tornado is. You get one piece of instrumentation in there that happens to survive. Okay, you've got one measurement. And how do you then take that information and sort of broaden it out? Well, what was actually the maximum wind speed, or what was the spatial distribution of them? So it's really challenging to get surface measurements. And because of that, then our target for resilience, our target for design, there's just so much uncertainty in what our target should be that just trickles down to all the other decisions that have to be made, which is why we're still dealing with so much of these issues now. Even though we've been studying tornadoes in detail. You can go back to the Lubbock tornado, 1971, right? Was a lot of great themes identified there, and we're still dealing with them now. And a lot of it is because we just don't have good ways of measuring the actual wind speeds, the actual wind characteristics of tornadoes.
Yeah, that's a very good point. When we look at even setting design winds in the middle of the country, the tornado events, we don't have the measurements to even put them into look at the probability distribution of a given event. We're getting at least ways to assess that and trying to do that for critical facilities. But I think most people out there don't realize it's really not included in the conventional design of a typical home or business. Now, critical facilities, that's a big difference. I think a lot of people may not even realize some of the early on tornado debris impact work came out of trying to understand debris impacts on critical facilities like a nuclear power plant. Like the debris impact standard's crazy. It's like a steel I-beam at 90 miles an hour or something like that. It's really sort of amazing, actually. So staying with that, we understand, severe convective storm winds, the winds that come with them are fairly, it's a tiny footprint and change readily. But there's also a perception, because of perhaps the small nature of this hazard, that there isn't as much we to our built environment can do. And you and I are probably fairly similar. We grew up knowing that there was something we could do about hurricanes. We could take an action, whatever that may be, whether it was leave, a different structure, or evacuate. I think about my grandma leaving the New Orleans metro, or just talking about, hey, we got to board up the windows, that kind of stuff. This is a little different in the severe convective storm environment. So let's talk a little bit about that, how the perception is a bit different.
Yeah, and the perception affects then the decision making, right? I mean, in a hurricane, you know what's coming. You've got time. although with some of we could talk about rapid intensification and how that's changing things, but generally there's been time to evacuate or try to get to a safer area. When you're dealing with convective storms, with how quickly they can pop up, you're talking about minutes that people have normally in that time scale to be able to make a decision and say, okay, I've got to either find a safe place to shelter in my home, or I've got to try to go to a community shelter. And if we have that identified beforehand, and I have to also make sure I've got a vehicle to actually drive in to get there. And what do I do with my pets? And what do I do with the elderly and things like that? And then if I'm driving, how do I know I'm not going to be driving into an unsafe situation, into the path of the tornado? So all those aspects of the decision making, the uncertainty around it, I think just leads more credence to the and credibility to the position that we have to have homes, we have to have residences that people can actually shelter in and expect to survive. You set a threshold of performance level somewhere. I mean, obviously, we would love everyone to be able to survive a direct impact of an EF5, which is sort of what our tornado shelters, the rated tornado shelters are for. But I would love to see us, the direct impact of an EF5 is just, we already talked about how small the footprint of a convective storm is, a tornado. Now you're talking about the actual area of, say, an EF5 tornado that's experiencing EF5 type wind speeds. That's such a tiny area that there's a whole lot of potential for improving performance of structures outside of that area to still maintain life safety, even in these really strong storms. And I think that's where the focus has to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could start to understand fatalities in a modern code built, even at a middle of the country home with a design wind somewhere between 90 and 105, but the loads are about the same. We've taken a big chunk out of that. I think we can all sort of discuss that it's a success story, better warnings, better communication, as well as the building itself. Thinking about tornadoes, we talked about how fast this evolves on timescales that really, it's something you as a human can't actively go protect your home very well. Like, you're not going to go put up shutters. You don't have the time to do that. Nor are we going to all sit in, say there's a moderate risk out for tomorrow. Okay, I'm going to say nothing happens. So there's sort of the rub with severe weather, is more often than not, you aren't impacted. How do you think that changes the perception? Whereas a hurricane, we usually sense some impact, right? The hurricane's not going away. It doesn't vanish in front of us in a 24-hour window. We're going to see some wind and rain. So there is some sensible impact. How do you think that changes people's perception when it comes to severe thunderstorms, where you might actually have a sunny day, even though you've been in a tornado watch all day?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely changes it, and the research is there to support it. And we've seen some of that. One of the interesting projects that I've had an opportunity to be a part of is actually one with Frank Lombardo at the University of Illinois and Daphne Ledoux and Laura Mayo at the University of Oklahoma, where, or is it Oklahoma? The University of Oklahoma or Oklahoma University? I feel like I always mess that up. But looking at interviewing survivors and looking at what was their decision making up to the point, how did they view the threat? How did the threat materialize? How much time did they actually have? When did they actually choose to shelter? Given all this other evidence out there. And yes, the uncertainty changes things. And this is not a knock at all on the National Weather Service Storm Prediction Center. They're doing a fantastic job within the, this amazingly complex system that they're trying to analyze and predict. But the fact of the matter is we can't predict down to the level of, okay, tomorrow you're going to have a tornado that passes, within a few yards of your house, so prepare now. And so all of the decisions that have to be made are made under a lot of uncertainty, with the knowledge that, okay, yes, even if I'm in a high risk or moderate risk area, I still have a very low probability of being directly impacted. And so that just, it just becomes an inhibitor to preparations and to, say, going off to a community shelter, because you're like, well, sure, I could go do this, but the risk is really low. And I've got, my kid has, this sports camp that I need to take him to, or that, the fill in the blank of the other sort of priorities that are going on in our life. And we all make some decision based on the risk that we feel, our perception of the risk, and our averseness to that risk. And so then it ultimately becomes a human issue that sort of couples with the engineering, which makes it such a fascinating topic to study from a research perspective. Because it absolutely does, false alarms, crying wolf, you hear those phrases all the time. And that certainly is going to affect how people make decisions.
Yeah, that's a very good one. Humans are very complicated, and all these different factors come into play. Now, so if we can, let's take the human element out of this and get to the shelter part. We still have a need for people to have substantial shelter from these events, whether it's a tornado or even an intense derecho like the 2020 event that caused fairly substantial damage. So what is the difference when we look at the engineering aspect? We're going to take a trip down to South Florida. So we have a home built under the modern Florida building code. The design wind speed is going to be 150, 160 kind of realm in the wind loads that come with that. Versus, say, a home that's built in, let's just call it, we'll pick a couple of cities. Wichita, Kansas, right in the old school, what we used to think of Tornado Alley, and Jackson, Mississippi. So just single family homes. What is the difference between those two structures from a building engineering standpoint and their resistance to extreme winds?
Yeah. Well, let me point to one broadly that I'm sure you're familiar with, but a lot of people aren't. And to be honest, I even wasn't when I first sort of started down this path. Is that one of the biggest differences is that if you're in that South Florida region and you're above 130 miles an hour, the building code kicks you over to, you have to have an engineer design your structure, and it has to be stamped, and it has to be designed to the specific loads at which it needs to resist based on the design wind speeds, et cetera. So you get that engineering detail, even that we would typically see in any other commercial building or so on. Now you're getting that on your home to resist those wind speeds. And so you're going to see what we refer to as a continuous load path, or if it has a good engineer that's designing it, there should be a continuous load path, meaning, think about the load is collected. Let's say it's collected at the roof level, and then the roof has to transfer it down to the roof to wall connection, and then the roof wall connection down through the studs to the foundation. And if there's multi-story, you got to transfer it through those stories. You got the lateral load path, the vertical load path. All of that needs to be designed. And there are, especially for wood frame homes, there's just so many connections through that load path. And having that engineering detail means that, down in South Florida, you're going to be connecting things with metal straps, and they're going to be metal straps that are sort of wrapping over elements, or it's going to be a continuous rod that transfers the load all the way down. You're going to have a obvious and a designed load path. Flip that over now to, Wichita, Kansas, or Jackson, Mississippi. These areas are going to be in portions of the country where they're only required to follow prescriptive building requirements, where it says, hey, you should use these fasteners at this spacing. And it's just some, in the building code or the wood frame construction manual, some kind of best practices or minimum standards for that construction. And unfortunately, what we see in our field assessments is that continuous load path has lots of discontinuities in it. And, even to the point where, you may have a hurricane strap, you may have an anchor bolt, but the other connections getting the load to that anchor bolt, which has a lot of strength in it, but if the connection just sort of up path of that is really weak, the load never even gets there. It fails even, prematurely, and really the anchor bolt didn't do any good. And we like to, I like to use the illustration of a chain. We're all familiar with you're only as strong as your weakest link. And I use that, this example where you can, think about like a anchor chain for a boat or something like that, a large ship, a yacht or something, where you've got this anchor chain really beefy. And then so you've got this really strong link, or links, and then you embed, a link from a piece of jewelry in that. How strong is your chain? It's as strong as the weakest link. But then flip that. The opposite is also true. If you have a jewelry chain, which is not very strong, and you put one really strong link in it, you're not improving the capacity of your chain at all. And that's what I see a lot of times when I'm going into these more modern structures, which kind of brings us back to a question you had asked earlier about sort of a general assessment where we are in performance. In tornadoes, that's what I'm seeing now is we're getting some strong links into the building. A lot of the new buildings now, they have hurricane straps, they have anchor bolts, but we've got several other critical weak links in between those or getting to those points that we've not really improved the overall strength of the structure that much. We're checking some boxes and says, we've got these key items, but the rest of the load path there's some key weaknesses there, and it's sort of shortcutting the failure mechanism and still leading to disproportionate damage.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this exact issue where you'll even hear community leaders talk about, we're going to require hurricane straps. Sometimes if you just do half the load path, you might actually make the situation worse from a life safety perspective. So let's kind of explore that. So you make your half a load path chain. Maybe you do put straps, but you have deficient anchor bolts or deficient wall to foundation connections. We'll get into some of the other damage amplifiers in a second, but what happens in that situation?
Well, I can tell you what happened in that situation because that's what we saw in Cookeville, Tennessee. That's what we saw some in Araby, Louisiana. These are recent tornadoes where the homes had, they addressed, say, at the roof, they were checking some of the boxes. They had the hurricane straps, or they had truss screws or things like that would help hold the roof on. But unfortunately, and that, I want to be fair here. That does help if you're in a, sort of a weaker, there's going to be a window of wind speeds where you experience that. If you have a hurricane strap, yes, it keeps the roof on and the wind isn't high enough to then also go down to the foundation and damage it, because you also have the weight of the structure. You have other connections that are sort of enhancing the resistance as you go further down the load path. But there is the potential, though, when you get these stronger storms to actually have a worse failure if all you've done is sort of address, let's say, the upper half of the load path and just keep the roof on. Well, now when you get a much stronger storm come through, where's the failure going to initiate? The weakest link may be now at the foundation, and now the whole structure is sort of moving as one mass. You have force equal to mass times acceleration. It's not going to resist that. It's going to collapse the entire structure. And a lot of times that's a much worse failure from a life safety. We want things to fail top down. A top-down failure is a good failure. And let's be honest, we were talking earlier about the design wind speeds in the middle portion of the country, the tornado-prone regions, 105, 115. Okay, if an EF3, EF4 tornado comes through, it's not surprising that we get damage, that we get some failures. What we want to see, though, is that top-down failure. We want it to fail first at the roof because that actually removes the elements that are collecting the load. That's going to reduce. If it fails at the roof first, that's going to actually reduce some of the load that are going down to the foundation, especially if it's roof sheathing. So we want to see that, whereas what I've been seeing more recently is sort of these foundation first failures. And that's where we start to see this uptick in life safety issues and serious injuries, fatalities, even in permanent site-built homes, which is, I think, scary, because I don't know how well that's understood and what we're really doing to address that, and which is why I'm always happy to put the spotlight on those things as we go forward.
Yeah, I think you sort of hit a little bit of the code and possibly the enforcement inspection. So let's take a break. You're listening to Disaster Discussions podcast. Our special guest today, Dr. David Roueche from Auburn University, Associate Professor of Structural Engineering. We're talking tornado damage and what can we do about it? What are the modes of damage? We've covered a lot already, starting from building codes. How do we design for structures? Now getting into a little bit of the damage amplifiers. So David, I'm going to start another damage amplifier that we talk about and have done a lot of work at IBHS about is garage doors. And I use the analogy that you're taking an EF0, EF1 type event and making the damage look like an EF2 or 3 because you had a failed garage door or big opening. Tell us, what is the chain of events that happens when you fail a thing like a garage door?
Yeah, it's such an important part of the damage sequence, and I can point to a few illustrations later on that I think illustrate it really well. But with the garage door, you have this large opening. If it's on the windward side of the storm, which I know in a tornado is a little bit challenging sometimes to decipher exactly what that is. Depending on what type of tornado it is. But If it's on the windward side, meaning the wind is directly impinging on the garage door, if that garage door buckles, air flows into that space, it's got to go somewhere. It's going to pressurize the interior of that garage. And if you've been following the IBHS research, and you know to close all your interior doors, then maybe that compartmentalizes the buildup in internal pressure to just the garage, or just one room or a couple of rooms. At least helps slow the sort of progression of that down. But it's going to pressurize that interior space. Well, now think about, if we can kind of try to talk through this, but if you've got a lot of times and when wind is interacting with the structure, the majority of the surface area of that building is actually experiencing negative or suction pressures. The wind is trying to pull the elements away from the building. So now if you're pressurizing the interior of the garage or the entire space, now think about those. If you want to think about sort of the wind vectors, the pressure vectors, they're actually aligned in the same direction. You're pushing from the inside, you're pulling from the outside, whether it's on the roof or the wall, et cetera. And yeah, you're increasing those winds. Those wind pressures can be anywhere 20, 40, 50%, depending upon what the wind speed itself is. That's significant because our structures, typical structures built in, again, Wichita, Kansas, et cetera, they're designed assuming that the building envelope stays intact, that you don't have that buildup in internal pressure. So when you have a large opening occur in the building and it's under that windward flow, you're significant, even more so, like you mentioned, Ian, you could take an EF0 and EF1 and easily turn those into the same loads you would get from an EF2 or an EF3 when you have this breach of a large opening like that. And what ends up happening usually is, either the roof then comes off. Again, you have a buildup of internal pressure. You have the suction pressures on the roof; those align. Roof comes off. Or, for example, in the recent Clarksville Tennessee tornadoes, what seemed to have happened there. Again, I was not there on site, so I'm sort of taking this from the videos and pictures and things I was able to get from social media and the NWS, et cetera. But it looks like there, the garage doors sort of blew in, and it actually pressurized and blew out a side wall. Well, guess what? Your side walls are what the structure relies upon to provide that lateral resistance, those shear walls. And so if you start blowing out a wall, now you've lost your lateral resistance on one side of the structure. You're just going to get this sort of torsional kind of twisting collapse, soft story collapse. And that's what looks to be the case of what happened in the Clarksville, Tennessee tornadoes. And we've seen it also in Nashville, a few other tornadoes. And so there's lots of things that can happen once the garage door blows in. None of them are good.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to jump off that. Like, we simulated that exact failure in our large test chamber where the garage door buckles inward and that outward wall basically fails at the foundation connection. We didn't let the full structural collapse happen of that structure, but you now have, you exposed the interior of the building. You have a wall collapse. There is nothing good that's going to come from that. So we've hit on the vulnerabilities, but I want to turn to we're going to stay with single family homes. You could apply a lot of this to multifamily construction as well. Anything stick built. We have this perception that there isn't structurally things we can do about tornadoes. When we look at the climatology of tornadoes, if we just use damage in the EF scale, most tornadoes are EF zeros and ones, but there's a lot that don't hit anything. And if you take some of the new mobile Doppler radar climatologies, you're looking more at an EF2 kind of mean scenario from a wind perspective. That's an awful lot of stuff we know how to deal with, right? Like, tell us a little bit about, how have we done so well in that same hurricane wind environment, but we're just not translating this stuff over.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, you can look at the EF2 tornadoes. I mean, that's in the 135 mile an hour range as far as the peak wind speeds, the upper threshold of that. And there are some differences, certainly. We've done some research on that. Others have done a lot more about, 135 mile an hour wind speed in a tornado nominally produces higher pressures than what you would get in a straight line sort of hurricane event. So there are some differences there. But, if you look at, back to our earlier discussion about our design wind speeds along the coast for hurricanes, 130 miles an hour is pretty low on, in the hurricane side of things for what we designed for. And we've seen lots of examples from Hurricane Laura and others where structures experience that 130, 135 mile an hour wind speed and structurally performed just fine. There was zero life safety issues in situations like that. So why can't we do that in tornadoes and not only address the EF2 tornadoes, but also the majority of the EF3, 4, and 5, the portions of the track of the those EF3 plus tornadoes is also going to experience just EF2 or lower wind speeds. And so there's so much potential to improve what we're getting right now. But I think it comes down to a point you made earlier. We have to accept that we can do this. I think there's just this perception out there that still persists that tornadoes are an act of God and they're so random and they're so, the structure doesn't matter. It's going to destroy whatever comes in its path. And I don't know how many times I've heard a comment like that being out in the field, sort of talking with the survivors or talking with, emergency personnel or so on. It's just like, came through and it doesn't matter what you would have had there. It would have blown it down. It's like, no, it shouldn't have. There are things that we can do. And it comes back to that continuous load path and understanding that, especially in a wood frame stick built home, you can do it, but all those little connections matter. And we've got to understand where those connections are, how the load passes from one to the next, and connect them together. We're not talking about anything that much more expensive than what we're doing now. It just needs that attention to detail. It needs that awareness, those spotlights shown in on those trouble spots, so that we're not sort of just trying to check a box and saying, yep, I got a hurricane strap, I've got an anchor bolt. Who cares, and not worrying about, well, what is my garage door like? What is the, what about the stud to the sheathing to the stud connection? And there's all these other connections that haven't gotten as much attention, but are just as critical to maintaining that load path. And if we connect things properly, we should be able to get 130, 135, 140 mile an hour winds and not experience significant structural damage.
Yeah, I think people really have this mental view. Tornadoes definitely strike fear far more, I think, than hurricanes. As someone who grew up in South Louisiana, there was less of a fear factor about hurricanes. Even I think about my own family who is terrified of severe weather, tornadoes especially. But hurricanes don't strike that same level of fear, I think, because we grew up thinking we could do something about it. Now, on that note, people also don't realize that that tiny area, even in the most intense tornadoes, you don't experience this constant swath of those kind of extreme or just absurd winds. Yes, they do happen. We've obviously research-wise documented them, but there's an awful lot in area that we can really take a chunk out of. IBHS, we talk about it calling narrowing the path of damage, but it's not even just narrowing it. We can even take chunks out of the middle too. So there's some opportunities. And I want to point out that Moore, Oklahoma is the only non-hurricane prone really code jurisdiction that has a building code that has a wind mitigation measures in it. They've modeled it after the Florida Building Code, brought in elements of the IBHS Fortified Home Standard. But unfortunately, it took 3 violent tornadoes within really about a decade and a half span to make a change. And at the time, that only, it cost about Kevin Simmons' estimate was about $2 more per square foot to go from basically no code to something really good. So from that perspective, the cost is actually pretty marginal, especially in new construction. The real estate market fluctuations are so much higher than everything. All the doom and gloom we hear about what is a better building code, especially in this space. I think hurricanes, we've done a great job. Yeah. I think we can just continue to build on it. But in the middle of the country, we're going from a lot of places pretty minimal to needing something better. We never saw the doom and gloom. It's never happened. The real estate market hasn't collapsed. There's so many other factors at play. Let's touch on that just for a little bit, and then we'll head into one of the bigger life safety areas that we still are having problems with. So let's talk about the cost of that first for a second.
Yeah, and I think the cost is absolutely important, and it's personal to me because, again, going back, I mean, my family did not have a lot of money. We grew up in a manufactured home because that's what my parents could afford, and I completely recognize and appreciate and support having trying to keep housing costs as low as possible, but we do owe it though to the occupants, the residents, to provide some minimum safety in those structures, and recognizing that most people are not going to leave that structure to go find a safer, community shelter. They just don't have time. That all the other factors that go into it. We've got to provide some minimum level, and that minimum level for the majority of the country in tornado-prone regions, I don't think is too low right now. There's too much life safety risk in that, and yes, there's a cost aspect, but while I appreciate it, at the same time, it's not really about the cost; it's about priorities, right? I mean, let's say, I understand we don't want to price people out of the market, but if it's going to cost an additional $2 per square foot, and we're saying, well, that's going to raise the cost of a new home by $1,000 or $2,000, and that's going to price 10% of the people out of the market. You could also, the option would be shrink the footprint a tiny bit to account for that, or some of the furnishings. It all comes down to priorities. Do we value safety? Do we value that minimum level of safety? And if somebody is informed about that and they're just willing to run the risk, at some point, this is the United States, you let people sort of make those decisions. But I don't think the public right now is really aware of what does code compliance give them, and what is the option for moving that to a higher level, like Moore, Oklahoma, where you can get life safety for sure, and hopefully even minimizing most of the damage in an EF2, what that brings them. So I think there's just a lack of awareness, because it's not really promoted in the realtors and so on aren't sort of promoting this. But it's not a pricing people out of the market. It's about prioritizing safety and making the public aware of what code compliance, that's basically getting a D on your exam. That's the bare minimum you need to pass, versus here's what you could get with a little bit more investment. But it may mean, well, instead of putting that really large back porch on your house, you may need a smaller overhang so that you can invest in safety instead. It's choices, it's priorities. It's less about the cost of it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We just have not seen the success translate from the coastal environment into the middle of the country. And a lot of those states, unfortunately, still don't have statewide uniformly enforced building codes. We know that's a problem. We can look all the way back to Hurricane Andrew with what happened in '92 with, I think there was some 20 different variants that would have affected wind performance in various jurisdictions across South Florida. And when we make it like that, it's not going to get enforced. It's not going to get inspected for. And that introduced that whole new level of problem. So we want, one, to get codes up where they need to be in the middle of the country to start dealing with the severe convective storm hazards. It's both straight line winds, and we're talking about tornadoes today. Now, we're going to turn to a topic that you and I talked about a lot, the community talks about a lot, is mobile and manufactured homes and tornadoes. 50%, somewhere around 50% of fatalities now in tornadoes occur in these types of structures. But we need to, let's set the record straight. What is going on? What is happening to what types of these structures? And what are we going to try to do about this problem? So let's start there and kind of set the stage of what's going on, and how do we tackle this? Because David, you said it, like this was your home as when you were a child, and your family's home. We have to figure out how to make that better for people. So let's go there. Let's start into this problem, and we'll take this out to the end of this disaster discussions podcast. I want to save perhaps this topic for the end. So let's dive in.
Yeah, there's so much that we can talk about on this. It's been just fascinating sort of unpacking this issue. And so I guess to start at the highest level, I think we all, and you alluded to the statistic there, about 50% of tornado fatalities occur in manufactured homes, despite mobile manufactured homes representing only 10, maybe 15% of the population. I think here in Alabama, it's right around right now 15% of housing units are mobile manufactured homes, and yet they represent over half of the fatalities. So they're disproportionately vulnerable to tornadoes and providing life safety. And so how do we know that? We've known that for a while. How do we fix that? And again, I think some of that goes back to, if you look at the coast where manufactured homes are, a lot of improvements have been made. So there, and when we talk about manufactured homes, there's sort of three zones. There's that HUD, the Housing and Urban Development. They basically regulate the construction of manufactured homes. And so down at the coast, Zone 2 and Zone 3 is what they refer to it as, which is sort of Mobile, Baldwin County in Alabama, all of Florida, and so on. They have additional requirements. A lot of it ties to the anchorage, but then just the pressures that they have to resist, things like that, they have been significantly enhanced. And from a wind perspective, or certainly from a life safety perspective, there's issues with damage, but certainly from a life safety perspective, they tend to perform pretty well. And we've had recent events, Hurricane Ian, Hurricane Laura, others certainly saw some failures from wind, but not nearly as widespread. And most of the failures were, what you'd expect, kind of top-down failures, some roofing gone, some maybe some windows broken, things like that, not complete, flipping of the structure. But when you go down to Zone 1, which covers the majority of the country and really most of the tornado-prone regions, I think what a lot of people don't realize, and I didn't when I first got into this, was that the regulations for Zone 1 manufactured homes have not changed since the 70s in terms of wind resistance. So we're using pressures, we're using the other aspects of the requirements, which are not a lot. They go back to the 70s. And think about all the advancements, how much more we know about tornadoes and what wind speeds, what wind pressures they induce. And we're still using information from the 70s to design them. So I think that's a sort of holistically, that needs to change if we want to address it. But then from kind of being out in the field, and I've investigated hundreds of manufactured home failures, the other aspect of it, though, is that the reason if we would really pinpoint and say, okay, well, why do we see so many more failures or so many more fatalities and severe injuries in manufactured homes than we do in site-built homes? It's because they get bottom-up failures. They're mostly prone to those bottom-up failures. You don't get sort of the top-down, roof starts to come off, and then some of the walls collapse, but the interior walls stay, and then lastly, it sort of completely goes off the foundation. No, we see the opposite. The first thing that fails usually is the anchorage, and the home flips, it rolls. In some cases, it's even flying through the air. And then I think the scariest, I can't fathom being in this situation, is when we were doing some investigation of the Beauregard, Alabama tornado, which is just 10 miles or so south of where I'm at right now, and seeing some of the manufactured homes there that were actually sucked into the path of the tornado. So let's say the tornado is moving kind of left to right. It's actually the inflow winds that are getting the manufactured home. The anchorage is so weak, it's actually picking them up, drawing them into the tornado. So they haven't even experienced the worst, anywhere near the worst of the tornado, which usually happens on the backside of the tornado. And it's already being drawn into that, flipping, rolling, etc. Yeah, you have very little chance of survival when you've lost your anchorage to the ground. And so, if I could point to a simple, here's what we need to do with manufactured homes, we've got to keep the anchorage from being the first thing to fail. It's not about building a bunker. We've got to understand that these are low cost or, low income housing solutions, but we have to have a safe failure sequence. It's got to fail top down. It can't fail bottom up. And right now, because we're using this, ground anchors and straps, and even more recently, they're using these pan anchorage systems that just make no sense to me whatsoever, how those are supposed to actually resist any uplift loads or the forces that we're trying to resist. We've got to fix that issue and have stronger requirements for anchoring Zone 1 homes. And the simplest solution would be to just take the anchorage requirements of Zone 2 and 3, shift those over to Zone 1, and to make sure that the anchorage is not the first thing to fail. And I think that would drastically reduce the number of fatalities and severe injuries that we see in manufactured homes.
So some of the most vulnerable of these are often the ones that are 30, 40 years old, that we may have sufficient or extreme anchoring deficiencies. I'm going to start here. The National Weather Service has shifted a bit in messaging towards suggesting folks that do live in these structures to actually leave during severe weather risk days. We've even talked about the concept that there are a handful of days a year that you might have to leave and go seek, spend the evening in a more substantial structure. I feel like that is a stopgap, but is there any? I think we have to get beyond just this. And what are some thoughts there around on this concept of both communicating, but also trying to find some element, whether it's a retrofit solution? We talked about the anchor. I mean, maybe that is a path toward increasing grant programs to help support this. Where do we go?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right that there has to be a two-pronged approach, because no matter what we change, let's say we change regulations tomorrow, well, we still have this huge stock of existing homes that are vulnerable, and we have to be able to communicate, and that's where the education part comes in, is people have to be aware of that vulnerability. And one of the things that I think is complicating that awareness is sort of this distinction between mobile and manufactured home. And we've used both of those terms sort of interchangeably so far, but I think it'd be good to sort of formally define it. Technically speaking, a mobile home is anything that was built before 1970. It's about 1974 is when the standards came into play and were enacted. So if it's built before 1974, mobile home. The vast majority of mobile homes are sort of out of commission. Now, you still see them. There's some older trailer parks and things like that, and you'll see them. So I'm not saying they're not an issue, but they're still extremely vulnerable, and the entire structure is vulnerable. I mean, you have water issues, you have the anchorage. There's so many factors of that. You can't be in one of those during a tornado, really, even in a severe thunderstorm. I mean, it's an unsafe environment. But then manufactured home, though, is technically anything built after 1974 is a manufactured home. And this is, we may have talked about this before, but I think I'm going to keep harping on it. We have to use the term manufactured home, because that's what most of the homes in this class right now are manufactured. They were built after 1974. And that's where we're seeing the majority of the fatalities occur, but just because of the exposure. The majority of the homes are manufactured. And that distinction matters. I always go back and there's several sort of really good case studies of this, as we talk with survivors, as we talk with prospective buyers. I was even talking with some friends of mine at church recently, and they were needing to buy, because of the situation they were in, needing to buy a home. And they were saying, well, the dealer was telling me that these are manufactured homes and these are so much better than the mobile homes, and people are dying in mobile homes. But the manufactured homes are just as safe as site built. And the reason they're able to get away with that is because a lot of the news reports and things like that will say, tornadoes strike the southeast and, 14 people were killed in mobile homes, because that's just sort of the language, the terminology that we're used to using. But then the industry sort of plays a game with us and then is telling new buyers, see, all the fatalities are in mobile homes. Manufactured homes are safer. And so I've really been trying to push this, and I'm glad that the National Weather Service has seen this as well and has joined in, and others refer to them as manufactured homes. People are dying in modern manufactured homes because the anchorage requirements are garbage. And that's the first thing to fail. And so we've got to fix that. But we've got to help people be aware and not, and again, in talking with people, they've had this perception that, well, I didn't go somewhere else, even though I was under a warning or a severe weather day or so on, because I was told that I was in a manufactured home and this is so much safer than a mobile home. It's like, no, if you're in an interior portion of the country in a zone 1 manufactured home, which the vast majority of the homes are, if you're under threat of a tornado, you really need to be getting out of that and going somewhere else. Whether that's a neighbor's home, whether it's a church, whether it's and there's no perfect, there are some very vulnerable churches. There's some very vulnerable site-built homes. So it's not a perfect, I wish I could just say, always go here and you'll definitely be safer. There's other factors, but in general, you're going to be safer in a site-built home. You're going to be safer in some other permanent building than you're going to be in a mobile or a manufactured home. Yet again, it comes down to the anchorage requirements. So we have to try to change the anchorage requirements, but we also have to fix that communication, education, awareness issue as well, so that people know just how vulnerable they are, whether it's a manufactured or a mobile home.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there is that guidance that on there's 3-4 nights a year especially those in the southeast U.S., that you may need to spend the night at a safer structure. And yes, you're giving yourself a better chance. I wish we could say we could stop this. You and I both, everyone that you work with, David, that I work with at IBHS, we all want to be able to say we can cut that probability to zero, but we're not there yet. And I'm not sure we can get to zero, but we can get to awful small is what we're shooting for. So something too that stuck out in a lot of our more rural, underserved communities, and this was presented at the recent American Meteorological Society national meeting during the Rolling Fork tornado. The actual warning communication chain broke down. We actually talk about how you need to have multiple ways to get warnings. Well, folks didn't actually digest or receive that warning personally until 3 minutes into the active event. So these tornadoes came with substantial lead time from the National Weather Service, but that chain of communication had also broken down. What are some of the ways we can start to think about tackling that? We say this ad nauseum, but it's one thing for you and I to sit here and have 3 ways to get your warning. Your phone, and what if you don't have cell service? What if a neighbor can't get a hold of you, or a friend? Like, a lot of people digest information just from friends who may text them. But how do we start to solve this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and maybe us as engineers aren't the best ones to solve this one. But I'll point to some of the research that we, again, going back to these survivor stories, talking with survivors and how they received information. And what was really a kind of interesting theme that came out of that was that you almost think of it as I think we ended up calling it in a manuscript that we submitted, sort of a belief in threat. So how their belief in the threat sort of materializes during the days leading up to, and then the minutes leading up to an event. And, there's a couple of indirect effects of that. So let's say before the event, a couple days out, the TV meteorologists and so on are saying, hey, be aware, here's, we're in a, moderate risk or an enhanced risk region, so be aware of it. Are they going to make a decision off of that? Probably not. But are they hopefully at least saying, okay, I need to have my feelers out and be ready to receive other information, other evidence? Their belief in the threat is sort of maybe bumping up just a little bit. And then as you get to the day of, the idea is then that hopefully they're not just waiting on a tornado siren, they're actually actively aware of the threat, and they're sort of looking for other information to decide. And that, I think, is maybe where we need a little bit, maybe more of a push is saying, hey, on those days, be active in sort of finding information, of looking out for information, being aware of it, checking in, if you will, on how that threat is materialized. Because as we talked about earlier, sometimes the threat 3 days out was really high, and then it kind of comes closer and it actually just sort of dissipates and storm mode's changed or whatever. But at least getting the public to be sort of have it on your radar that you need to be check in on the weather, regardless of whether you've gotten a warning or you've gotten something else. But sort of active, instead of waiting for them all to come to you, can we start being more proactive about finding that information? Because we found that it was just, in order for someone to actually act on the information, they typically needed several pieces of evidence to sort of come together to then motivate that actual action. And unfortunately, what most people waited for was environmental cues. So they waited till they heard something, saw something, felt something before they responded. But what we saw that was encouraging was that even if they didn't get the environmental cues, if somebody had a neighbor call, a friend call, if the TV meteorologist mentioned a specific road, so there's a whole host of ways, but the person has to be in sort of that receiver mode of, hey, I'm actively alert and I'm looking for information to sort of build that evidence case, build that belief in the threat that then allows me time to shelter inside my home or go seek shelter at a neighbor's home, et cetera. And so it's less about the 10 minutes leading up to the tornado, and it's more about what is our awareness several hours before the tornado. Are we out actively looking for for evidence of how that threat is
Yeah,
materializing.
for sure. And I want to call to action to our listeners. If you're listening to this Disaster Discussions podcast, you are a weather savvy person. So help your friends and neighbors. We just talked about how folks can digest information very quickly, and we rely on that. We want to have those cues. You can help be that action for your friends and neighbors, your elderly relatives, things like that. So stay weather aware when we do have a risk day. Be that person that helps make that connection. So that's our call to action today for all our listeners out there here on the Disaster Discussions podcast. David, this has been wonderful. You and I could go on for multiple hours, probably days on this topic. We could do a marathon event. But I want to give you a chance to kind of wrap it all up. And so what are some of the things you would tell folks? What can we do about tornado damage? And how do we need to approach our built environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key takeaway is one we touched on earlier, which is just getting to the mindset of you can do something. This is not and that something does not have to be build a bunker, build an underground bunker. There's really two things that you can do. I guess I could boil it down to three maybe. First is just we've got to have a greater awareness of the vulnerability of the structures that we live in. How vulnerable is our home? And there's different levels of this. And this is one where I think there still needs to be a lot of research, and we're trying to work on some of this right now, is how do you communicate and identify these sort of life safety issues in existing homes? I think back to, I think at the home I live in, and Ian, the home that you're living in right now, if we were to assign a vulnerability score to it, what would we give it? How much do we know about our own home? At a higher level, we know, well, okay, it's a permanent home. It's not a manufactured home. So maybe that shifts us sort of one direction. We at least for somewhere over here. But if I'm in a permanent home up on a crawl space foundation with no anchorage, I'm sorry, I'm just as vulnerable as a manufactured home. But how do we communicate? How can we educate the public on what to look for and how to sort of quantify or understand that vulnerability? And that's one where I wish I had better answers for, and because it's just hidden typically behind the drywall and everything else. So being as aware of you as you can, don't overestimate your structure's strength and resistance. But there's some things, again, manufactured versus site built, crawl space versus slab, that at least on average tend to shift you one direction in the vulnerability. So being aware of that. And then the second would be, if you are on that sort of on the weaker side of the vulnerability spectrum, then what are your options? If you are very vulnerable, if you're have that high vulnerability, storm shelter, or safe rooms, we've talked about that. And I know those are not a cheap expense, but we're talking about several $1,000s where you can have absolute peace of mind, that absolute protection, which is so valuable to so many people, just having that peace of mind that if something were to happen, I've got somewhere to go where I will absolutely be safe. We've never had a fatality in a fully approved storm shelter safe room. That's peace of mind. And then the other would be if you're in the market for a new home, whether it be a new to you home or actually building from ground up, what do you know about the safety of that home? Go to, IBHS has fantastic resources on Fortified on what a continuous load path looks like. Simpson Strong Tie, FEMA, there's resources out there. And I think it's a side point maybe to do a better job of sort of collating all those and making it more public forward as to one place, here's what to look for. But they're out there. What is your builder telling you about, can you push them? Can you push the realtor when you're looking at homes? Well, what do you know about the anchorage? What do you know about the foundation? We've got to start asking those questions and making that a priority as we select our next home. And it's not going to change overnight, but these are practical things that we can do now to change the future and then address the present of how safe we are and how aware we are of that safety.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we think about safety standards. We look at safety standards on our kids' toys, or baby food, across cars,
sure.
Food and drugs, all of it. But how much do you know out there about your home and how it's built? But also knowing that there is something you can do about it. So this has been an absolute joy. talking with David Roueche, Associate Professor of Structural Engineering at Auburn University and an expert in extreme winds and their impact on the built environment. This has been a fun discussion. So please give us a subscribe on all your favorite podcast providers. We are out there for you. You can also find the video of David and I chatting on our YouTube channel. Also, check out IBHS on all the social media channels, as well as IBHS.org. This has been the Disaster Discussions Podcast. I've been your guest host today, Dr. Ian Giammanco, Managing Director for Standards and Data Analytics at IBHS. And we'll see you next time on the Disaster Discussions Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Disaster Discussions Podcast, an IBHS production. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app, or watch the podcast on our website at ibhs.org/Disaster Discussions Podcast and the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety YouTube channel. Connect with us on our social media pages on Twitter at Disaster Safety, Facebook at facebook.com/Disaster Safety, and on Instagram at IBHS_org. For more great content from IBHS, including ongoing research efforts happening in our facility, episodes of our podcast, and more, visit IBHS.org.